The year was 1886, and the town of Redemption, Wyoming, was a skeleton picked clean by disappointment. Dust, fine as ground bone, settled in a permanent shroud over everything, filling the ruts of the main street where wagons no longer troubled the silence. It coated the blank, staring windows of the assayer's office and the general store, and it softened the edges of the gallows that stood like a lonely, forgotten question at the edge of town. For Sheriff Amos Blackwood, this silence was the only constituent he had left. It was a demanding citizen, always present, always listening. Amos was a man shaped by the geography of his own grief, his features weathered and stark like the landscape that surrounded him. He had arrived in Redemption a decade prior with a wife, a son, and a heart full of the foolish hope that silver veins promised. The town had thrummed then, a chaotic symphony of pickaxes, saloon pianos, and shouted ambition. But the silver had been a fickle mirage, and the earth that had promised riches had instead taken everything. A fever stole his boy, a wasting sickness took his Eleanor, and the failed mines bled the life from the town until only he remained, the solitary lawman in a jurisdiction of ghosts. He stayed not out of duty to a place, but out of a stubborn refusal to abandon the dead. Leaving felt like a second betrayal, so he walked his rounds in the quiet, his boots stirring up memories with every step. He would check the door on the mercantile, its shelves long since emptied by departing townsfolk. He would straighten a fallen shingle on the smithy's roof, the forge cold for 5 years. His life was a ritual of preservation, a meticulous tending of a grave that spanned 10 square acres. He was the caretaker of a monument to failure, and the solitude had hollowed him out, leaving a man who spoke more to the wind than to any living soul. His stasis was absolute, a life measured in the slow transit of the sun across a vast, indifferent sky. He ate canned beans and jerky, read the same 3 books until the words blurred into meaningless patterns, and watched the seasons turn on the high prairie without expectation. Hope was a language he had forgotten. He was a man waiting for his own end, the last light to be extinguished in a town already consumed by darkness. It was on a Tuesday in late summer, the air thick with heat and the drone of locusts, that the rhythm of his desolate world was irrevocably broken. He first heard it as a faint, rhythmic creaking, a sound so alien he thought it was a trick of the wind moaning through the slats of the abandoned livery. But it grew steadily louder, accompanied by the plodding of heavy hooves and the low curse of a man's voice. Amos pushed himself off the porch of the sheriff's office, his hand resting on the worn grip of his pistol out of pure, ingrained habit. Down the sun-bleached expanse of the main street, a great, lumbering freight wagon was approaching, pulled by 4 exhausted-looking mules. It was a vessel of the outside world, a world he no longer considered himself a part of, and its intrusion felt like a sacrilege. A stout, weary-looking man with a sweat-stained hat and a grim set to his jaw handled the reins. He pulled the team to a halt in front of Amos, the sudden silence that fell in the wake of the wagon's noise seeming deeper and more profound than before. "This is Redemption?" the man asked, his voice raspy with road dust. He didn't wait for an answer, his eyes scanning the dead storefronts with a dawning look of unease. "It is," Amos said, his own voice sounding rusty to his ears. "What's your business here? Town's closed." The man, who introduced himself as Garrett Vance, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Business is delivery. Got a special cargo. Paid in advance." He jerked his thumb toward the canvas-covered bed of the wagon. "For the miners of the new silver strike. Got a list of names right here." Amos felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine, a feeling more chilling than any winter wind. "New silver strike," he repeated, the words tasting like ash. "That's what the contract says." Garrett's gaze was hard, impatient. 12 brides for 12 miners, come all the way from St. Louis. Now, where are the grooms? This land ain't fit for much, but I imagine they're eager to collect their delivery." Before Amos could form a reply, the canvas flap at the back of the wagon was pushed aside. A woman's face appeared, framed by the gloom within. She was young, but her eyes held a weariness that rivaled his own. Behind her, other faces stirred in the shadow sea of pale, anxious expressions. There were 12 of them, he realized with a sickening lurch in his gut. 12 women packed into the back of a wagon like freight, delivered to a graveyard. Amos looked from their expectant faces to the dusty, sun-bleached street, to the silent buildings that stood as tombstones for the men they had come to marry. He looked at the list Garrett Vance thrust at him, a roll of parchment bearing 12 names. He knew every single one. He had helped bury them himself 3 months ago, after the north shaft of the old Morning Star mine had collapsed, taking the last of Redemption's desperate dreamers with it. The wagon master saw the look on Amos's face. "What is it, Sheriff? Don't tell me there's a problem." Amos drew a slow, heavy breath. The silence of his town was about to be shattered by a sound he hadn't heard in years, the sound of breaking hearts. "There's a problem," he said, his voice flat and heavy as a burial stone. "Their husbands are all dead." The words hung in the oppressive heat, stark and brutal. For a moment, no one moved. Garrett Vance stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. From inside the wagon, a collective gasp was smothered by the thick canvas. The woman who had first looked out, her name he would later learn was Clara Hale, descended the short ladder from the wagon bed, her worn calico dress a splash of defiant color against the town's monochrome decay. She landed softly in the dust, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on Amos with an intensity that demanded the truth, no matter how jagged. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying a steel that cut through the wagon master's blustering. Amos met her eyes. He felt the weight of 12 ruined futures settle upon his shoulders. He owed them the dignity of the unvarnished truth. "The men you were contracted to marry. There was a mine collapse this spring, the north shaft of the Morning Star. It took 12 men. The last 12 men in Redemption, aside from me." He gestured to the barren hills. "There is no new silver strike. There's nothing here. I'm sorry." A wail rose from inside the wagon, a thin, piercing cry of pure despair. Another woman began to sob openly, her grief raw and unrestrained. Clara's face, which had been a mask of stoic control, paled. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the knuckles white. She looked past Amos, her gaze sweeping over the desolate street, the vacant windows, the profound and terrible emptiness of it all. The hope that had carried her and 11 others 1,000 miles across the country died right there, in the dust of a town named Redemption. Garrett Vance finally found his voice, a roar of fury and frustration. "Dead? What do you mean dead? I was paid. I have a contract." He waved the parchment as if it could resurrect the men listed upon it. This is fraud." "It was likely a lie born of desperation, Mr. Vance," Amos said, his voice low and tired. "A story told to a broker back east to secure passage for these women. A final, foolish gamble that failed." The other women began to emerge from the wagon, a slow, hesitant procession of disbelief and shock. They were a flock of sparrows stranded in a desert, their traveling clothes rumpled, their faces etched with the fatigue of the journey, now compounded by the crushing weight of this revelation. There was a young girl, barely 16, who looked about in wide-eyed terror, an older widow whose face was already carved with lines of past sorrow, a stern-faced woman who held a Bible to her chest like a shield. They gathered in a tight, lost cluster behind Clara, their varied anxieties coalescing into a single, palpable wave of fear. "So what now?" Clara's voice was sharp, pulling Amos's attention back to her. "What becomes of us? You can't mean to leave us here." "That ain't my problem," Garrett Vance snarled, his face reddening. "I delivered them to the agreed. Upon location, my contract is fulfilled. What happens next is between them and, well, it seems there's no one but you, Sheriff." He looked at the women with a cold, calculating eye that made Amos's skin crawl. "My payment for transport was only half. The grooms were to pay the other half. I'm out a considerable sum." "These women have nothing," Amos stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They have themselves," Vance retorted, his meaning ugly and clear. "There's a camp at 3 Rivers. Rough men, but they have coin. They'd pay for companions." A protective instinct, Amos thought, long dead, flared to life inside him. He took a step forward, placing himself between Vance and the women. His hand fell once more to his pistol, and this time it was not from habit. "This is still my town, Mr. Vance, and these ladies are now under my protection. You will not be taking them anywhere. You'll water your mules and be on your way." Vance's eyes narrowed, measuring the lone sheriff against the backdrop of the dead town. For a tense moment, the only sound was the buzzing of flies and the soft weeping of one of the women. Finally, with a contemptuous snort, the wagon master turned away. "Fine. Have it your way, Sheriff. Protect your ghosts and your new strays. But don't think this is the end of it. I'll get what I'm owed." He climbed back onto his seat, cracked his whip over the mules' heads, and steered the heavy wagon down the street toward the town's well. The women watched him go, their shoulders slumped in a mixture of relief and renewed despair. They were safe from him for now, but they were stranded. Stranded in a ghost town, with no money, no prospects, and only a grim, solitary stranger for a guardian. Amos turned to face them, the 12 pairs of eyes fixed on him, waiting. The task before him was monumental. He had to provide shelter, food, and some semblance of safety. He, who had struggled to keep one man alive, was now responsible for 12 women. "The old hotel is mostly intact," he said, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "The roof is sound. The beds are there. It'll be dusty." It was a pathetic understatement. The Grand Hotel, like everything else, was a cavern of dust and cobwebs, a place where memories slept uneasily. "I'll get the doors open. We can get you settled. Then we'll see about provisions." Clara Hale nodded, a flicker of resolve replacing the shock in her eyes. She turned to the others, her voice taking on a new tone of command. "You heard the sheriff. Let's get our things. We're not sleeping in the street." Slowly, the women moved to collect their meager belongings, small trunks, cloth bundles, worn satchels that contained the entirety of their worldly possessions. Amos walked toward the hotel, the jangle of his keys a lonely sound. He was unlocking more than just a building. He was unlocking the door to a new, complicated, and terrifying chapter in the life of his dead town. Redemption was no longer empty. It was full of broken hopes, and he was their keeper. The inside of the Grand Hotel smelled of time itself, a thick, musty scent of decay, dry rot, and forgotten lives. Sunlight struggled through grime-caked windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust in the cavernous lobby. Furniture stood like shrouded specters beneath a uniform layer of grey. Amos pushed open the heavy oak doors, the screech of the hinges echoing like a protest. The women followed him in, their footsteps hesitant on the creaking floorboards. They looked around at the ruinous splendor, at the grand staircase leading to a shadowed upper floor, and at the cobwebs that draped from the chandeliers like macabre decorations. For a moment, their shared despair was so potent, Amos could almost taste it. "It's large," a younger woman named Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. "It's a wreck," another, more practical-minded woman named Esther declared flatly. Clara Hale, however, surveyed the scene with a different eye. She ran a hand along the dusty reception counter, leaving a clean streak in the grime. "It's a roof," she said, her voice firm. "And it has walls. That's more than we had an hour ago. We'll make it work." She turned to the others, her gaze sweeping over them, assessing and encouraging in a single look. "We'll start by airing the place out. Open every window that will open. Then we find the well and haul water. We're not going to let this place swallow us whole." A spark of her resolve seemed to catch. The women, who had been a huddled mass of fear, began to move. They fanned out, their voices tentative at first, then growing stronger as they assigned tasks and worked together. Amos watched for a moment, an observer in his own town. He saw Clara directing two women to tackle the downstairs rooms while she and another, a quiet woman named Rose, headed for the kitchen. He had intended to manage everything himself, but he saw now that they were not helpless. They were survivors. He left them to it, his own role shifting. He was no longer just a gatekeeper, but a provider. He crossed the street to the mercantile, the lock groaning as he turned the key. Inside, the air was still and stale, but it was a treasure trove. Canned goods still lined some of the shelves, peaches, beans, salted meats. Sacks of flour and cornmeal were infested with weevils, but might be salvageable. He began the methodical work of taking inventory, separating the spoiled from the usable. It was a task that grounded him, the simple, physical labor, a welcome distraction from the enormity of his new responsibility. For the next several days, a new routine settled over Redemption. It was a rhythm of shared work and quiet coexistence. The days were filled with the sounds of scrubbing, the thud of buckets being set down, the murmur of women's voices echoing where only wind had spoken for years. At night, a single lantern would burn in the hotel lobby, a beacon of defiant life in the encompassing darkness. Amos found his solitude fractured in 1,000 ways. He brought them supplies. He repaired the hotel's water pump. He patched a section of leaking roof. They, in turn, began to transform the decaying hotel. They beat rugs until clouds of dust billowed from the windows. They scrubbed floors until the wood's original grain reappeared, and they washed the windows until the Wyoming sun could finally pour in, unobstructed. Communication was sparse and functional. A "thank you, Sheriff," when he delivered a side of venison he'd hunted. "The pump is working again," from him. They were all wary, circling each other at a distance. He was the grim authority figure, the man who was part of the landscape that had betrayed them. To him, they were a constant, living reminder of the town's final, tragic failure. One evening, he brought a stack of firewood to the hotel's kitchen. He found Clara there alone, kneading a mass of dough on a flour-dusted table. The kitchen, once a pit of grime and nesting mice, was now clean and organized. A fire crackled in the great iron stove, casting a warm, flickering light that softened the hard lines of her face. She didn't look up as he set the wood down. "There's no need for you to feed us all, Sheriff," she said, her voice even. "We can't pay you." "No one's asking for pay," he replied, his voice gruffer than he intended. "People need to eat." "We are not your burden," she insisted, punching the dough with a ferocity that seemed to carry all her frustration. "I know what you are," Amos said quietly. "You're stranded. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't mine either, but here we are." She stopped, her hands buried in the dough. She finally looked at him, her gaze searching. "Why do you stay here, in this tomb?" The question was direct, unadorned. He found himself answering with a truth he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "My wife and my son are buried up on that hill," he said, nodding toward the small, neglected cemetery. "Leaving feels like forgetting." Clara's expression softened. The fight went out of her posture. She wiped a stray bit of flour from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I had a daughter. She would have been 7 this year. The cholera took her. Her father, he followed a few months later, a different kind of sickness, a sickness of the soul." She looked down at her hands. "I came out here because there was nothing left for me back there. I thought a new place, a new life." In that moment, the wall between them became porous. He saw not just a resilient leader, but a grieving mother. She saw not a grim jailer, but a fellow mourner. They were two people bound by loss, standing in the ruins of other people's dreams. "The bread smells good," he said after a long silence, a clumsy peace offering. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Esther found a wild yeast culture. She says we can make this place a home yet." The idea was so absurd it was almost beautiful. A home. Here. But looking at the clean kitchen, hearing the distant sound of the other women talking in the lobby, for the first time in a long time, the word didn't sound entirely impossible. The connection forged in that kitchen began to spread, slowly, cautiously. The women started to include Amos in their evening meals, setting a place for him at the end of the long dining table. The conversation was stilted at first, but gradually stories emerged. Small histories of lives left behind, of hopes for a future that had evaporated into the thin mountain air. Amos, in turn, found himself speaking more, telling them about the town as it had been, pointing out which buildings had belonged to which family, breathing a little life back into the ghosts. Section, he saw their individual strengths emerge. Esther, the practical one, became the group's quartermaster, rationing their salvage supplies with fierce efficiency. Young Abigail, who had seemed so terrified, had a gentle hand with the mules Vance had abandoned in his haste, and she discovered a talent for gardening in a small, protected plot behind the hotel. Rose, the quiet, religious woman, possessed a deep well of calm that soothed frayed nerves and mediated the inevitable disputes that arose from 12 women living in such close quarters. They were not just surviving, they were building something fragile and tenacious. Amos found himself feeling a fierce, paternal protectiveness over them all. They had brought life back to redemption, a life he hadn't realized he was starving for. The silence was no longer absolute. It was punctuated by work, by conversation, and sometimes, late at night, by the sound of soft singing from the hotel. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. One afternoon, as Amos was reinforcing the supports on the hotel's long porch, he saw a rider approaching from the east. It was not the familiar, lumbering shape of a prospector's mule, but a fast-moving horse. As it drew closer, the cold dread he'd felt on the day of the women's arrival returned with a vengeance. It was Garrett Vance, and he was not alone. 2 other men, rough-looking and heavily armed, rode with him. Vance pulled his horse up a short distance from the hotel, his eyes raking over the signs of life, the clean windows, the smoke curling from the kitchen chimney, the line of laundry snapping in the breeze. A cruel smile twisted his lips. "Well, well, Sheriff," he called out, his voice dripping with malice. "Looks like your little flock has been busy. Made the place almost presentable." Amos slowly set down his hammer, his body going tense. He moved to the edge of the porch, his hand hovering near his gun. "I told you to be on your way, Vance. You have no business here." "Oh, I think I do," Vance sneered. "I've been thinking about our contract. It says I'm to deliver these women to their sponsors in redemption. It doesn't say those sponsors have to be the original men." He gestured to his companions. "I've found new sponsors, men from the Three Rivers camp. They've made me a very generous offer for the women's companionship contracts, an offer that will cover my losses and then some." The door to the hotel opened and Clara stepped out, her face a mask of cold fury. Behind her, the other women gathered, their faces pale with fear. "We have no contract with you," Clara said, her voice ringing with defiance. "Your husband signed the papers, ma'am," Vance said with mock politeness. "Made you property to be delivered, and I am delivering you." The raw greed and contempt in his eyes made it clear this was no negotiation. He had come to take them by force if necessary. The fragile community they had started to build was now standing on the brink of violent destruction. The stakes had escalated from mere survival to a fight for their very freedom and dignity. Amos looked at the 3 armed men, then at the 12 frightened but resolute women standing behind him. His town, his responsibility, his fight. "They're not going anywhere," Amos said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "This is their home now. Turn your horses around and ride out. This is your only warning." Vance laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the silent buildings. "You and what army, Sheriff? There's one of you. And 12 helpless women. This won't take long." He and his men dismounted, their intentions brutally clear. The fleeting dream of a new life in redemption was about to become a waking nightmare. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. The light cast long, distorted shadows that turned the empty street into a theater of menace. Vance and his men advanced slowly, confidently, their spurs jingling a deathly rhythm in the charged silence. "Barricade the doors," Amos ordered Clara in a low, urgent voice, never taking his eyes off the approaching threat. "Use the heavy furniture from the lobby. Don't open them for anyone but me." Clara didn't hesitate. She herded the other women back inside, her voice a sharp, commanding whisper. "You heard him. The tables, the armoires, anything heavy. Move." Amos stepped off the porch, positioning himself in the middle of the street. He drew his Colt peacemaker, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the evening quiet. He was one man, yes, but he was one man on his own ground. He knew every alley, every rooftop, every crumbling wall in this town. It was an advantage he intended to use. "This is your last chance, Vance," Amos called out, his voice steady. "Leave now, and you live to see another sunrise." "Brave words for a man about to die alone," Vance shot back. He and his men fanned out, their own pistols now drawn. They expected a straightforward fight, a simple matter of overwhelming numbers. They had misjudged the sheriff, and they had profoundly underestimated the women. As the men advanced, a window on the second floor of the hotel slid open. Esther appeared, her face grim. With a heave, she upended a large cast-iron pot. A cascade of boiling water, saved from the dinner preparations, hissed through the air. One of Vance's men screamed as the scalding liquid struck his shoulder and arm, stumbling back and dropping his weapon in agony. The attack from the window momentarily stunned the other two. It was the opening Amos needed. He fired, not at Vance, but at the dust near the feet of the second hired man, kicking up a spray of dirt. The man flinched, his own shot going wide, embedding itself in the wooden facade of the saloon across the street. "They're in the hotel," Vance roared, recovering his composure. "Forget the sheriff, get the door." While Vance and the remaining gunmen charged the hotel porch, Amos melted back into the shadows of the alley between the sheriff's office and the mercantile. He knew this labyrinth. He moved swiftly and silently, emerging behind the livery stable, which gave him a clear angle on the hotel's entrance. Vance and his man threw their shoulders against the hotel's main doors, which groaned but held firm against their assault. The women had done their work well. Frustrated, Vance bellowed, "Burn them out. Get the oil from the wagon." But from the upper floors of the hotel came a new form of resistance. Windows shattered as Abigail, Rose, and two others began hurling anything they could, lift heavy glass paperweights from the hotelier's old desk, pieces of firewood, a broken chair. The barrage wasn't lethal, but it was chaos. It forced Vance and his man to retreat from the porch, seeking cover behind the water trough. It was in that moment of distraction that Amos made his move. He stepped out from behind the livery, his pistol leveled. "Vance," he yelled. The wagon master spun around, his face a mask of pure rage. He raised his pistol to fire at Amos, but he was exposed. Before he could pull the trigger, Clara appeared on the hotel balcony, a heavy, rusted rifle in her Hansa relic she must have found in one of the hotel's back rooms. It had probably not been fired in a decade, but she held it with a steady purpose that was terrifying. "Drop it," she commanded, her voice ringing out with absolute authority. Vance was caught between them, Amos in the street, Clara on the balcony. He hesitated, his eyes darting between the grizzled sheriff and the determined woman. That hesitation was his undoing. Amos didn't wait for him to make a choice. He fired. The shot was precise, aimed not to kill but to disarm. The bullet struck the pistol in Vance's hand, sending it spinning into the dust with a metallic clang. Vance cried out, clutching his hand, his fingers numb and possibly broken. His last remaining man, seeing his employer disarmed and his partner still nursing his burns, lost his nerve. He threw his gun down in the dirt. "I'm done. I ain't dying for this," he yelled, raising his hands in surrender. The fight was over. The sudden silence that fell was broken only by the whimpering of the burned man and Vance's ragged, pain-filled breaths. Amos walked forward slowly, his Colt still trained on Vance. He kicked the discarded pistols away into the darkness. Clara remained on the balcony, the rifle still held at the ready, a silent sentinel, ensuring the victory was complete. The other women slowly emerged from the hotel, their faces pale, but their eyes blazing with a mixture of terror and triumph. They had not been helpless. They had defended their home. "Get him," Amos said to the uninjured man, gesturing toward his moaning partner. "Take your wagon and get out of my town. If I ever see your faces again, I won't aim for your gun." Scrambling, the two hired men helped each other up and half-dragged, half-carried a whimpering Vance to his wagon. Without a backward glance, they hauled themselves aboard and whipped the mules into a frantic retreat, disappearing into the night from which they came. Amos stood in the middle of the street, the smoke from his pistol curling in the cool night air, and finally allowed himself to breathe. He looked up at Clara on the balcony. She lowered the heavy rifle, her shoulders slumping slightly with the release of tension. Their eyes met across the distance, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had faced the darkness together and held it back. Redemption, the town of ghosts, had been defended by the living. In the quiet aftermath, the world seemed to hold its breath. The adrenaline of the fight ebbed away, leaving behind a profound and bone-deep exhaustion, but also something else, a sense of earned peace. The women slowly came out onto the porch, gathering around Amos not as dependents, but as partners in a shared victory. Esther brought a strip of clean cloth and a bottle of whiskey from the saloon to tend to a shallow graze on Amos's forearm he hadn't even noticed. He looked at their faces, smudged with dirt and tears, but shining with a strength he knew now was unbreakable. They had been tested, and they had forged a bond in the heart of that fire. The last vestiges of mistrust between them and him had been burned away, leaving only a deep and abiding respect. Clara came down the stairs, the heavy rifle left behind. She stopped in front of him, her gaze clear and direct. "Thank you, Amos," she said, using his first name for the first time. The formality of sheriff had been shed in the heat of the battle. "You saved my life up there," he countered, nodding toward the balcony. "You all did." He looked around at the circle of women. "This town, this home, you defended it." A new equilibrium had been reached. It was no longer his town that he was allowing them to live in. It was theirs, together. The sun rose the next morning, on a different world. The sounds that filled the air were not of struggle, but of determined creation. The splintered wood of the hotel door was repaired. The garden plot behind the hotel was expanded. Plans were made, voices rising with cautious optimism. They talked of starting a school for the younger women, of turning the mercantile into a true cooperative store, of raising chickens. They spoke of a future. The town of redemption began to live up to its name. It wasn't about salvation from sin, but about reclamation from despair. It was a redemption for the women who had been sold and abandoned, and it was a redemption for Amos, who had been a living ghost among the dead. The weight of his past losses had not vanished, but it no longer defined him. It was now part of a larger story, one that included life as well as death. Weeks turned into months. An autumn of crisp, golden days settled over the valley. The women's resilience transformed the town. The hotel became a warm, communal home. The clang of a hammer from the old smithy rang out as Amos and Esther worked together to repair tools. Laughter, a sound once utterly alien to these streets, became a common occurrence. One evening, Amos and Clara stood on the porch of the hotel, watching the last light fade behind the mountains. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and baking bread. A single lamp glowed in the dining room window, a warm, inviting star in the vast, dark prairie. "Abigail thinks she can get the old saloon piano to work," Clara said, a small smile playing on her lips. "She wants to have a dance." Amos chuckled, a low, rusty sound he was still getting used to making. A dance in a ghost town. What would the ghosts think? "I think they'd be happy the old place has some life in it again," she replied softly. She looked at him, her expression open and full of a quiet warmth that thawed a place in his heart he'd thought frozen forever. "We built something here, Amos, out of nothing." He looked out at the street, at the buildings that no longer seemed like tombstones, but like the sturdy bones of a new beginning. He looked at the light in the window, a beacon against the encroaching night. Home was not a place you found on a map. It was a place you made with your hands and your heart. It was a place you defended. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, surrounded by a strange and wonderful family of 12 resilient women, the lone sheriff of a ghost town had finally found his. He reached out, and his hand found Clara's, their fingers lacing together in the quiet twilight. They didn't need to say a word. They just stood together, watching the stars begin to appear over their town, their redemption.